Hello, welcome to Cubs PS Plus, a Northside numbers game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. Cubs PS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining great shows like The Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, and Baseball Rabbit Hole. The Bleacher Bunch feed is available wherever it is you get your podcasts, and Cubs PS Plus is always available, ad-free, to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPSPlus, where you can support the show and always find a variety of benefits for as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, BlueSky, and YouTube, all at Cubs PS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it, please drop a review wherever it is you find your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you. Maybe you can share an episode with a friend. Welcome into episode 71, the Wade Davis episode of this podcast. The Cubs traded for Davis after the 2016 season when Aroldis Chapman went back to the Yankees. Davis had a great year for the Cubs, posting a 2.30 ERA with 32 saves. It was one of the biggest reasons the Cubs were able to make their third straight trip to the NLCS. In a cruel twist of fate, though, Davis signed with the Rockies in 2018 and threw one of the third scoreless against the Cubs as the Rockies beat the Cubs in 13 innings in the 2018 wildcard game. This spring, we've seen a lot from Cubs prospects. So Greg Zumach of Northside Bound and the Cubs on Deck podcast joined me for this episode. We talk about what we've seen in spring training games from the Cubs prospects and what that means going forward. After that, we jump into his coverage of the upcoming MLB draft and what he's seeing from college baseball this season. Among those we discuss, since I'm a homer, is Iowa's Brody Brecht. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Hey, this week I'm thrilled to be joined again by Greg Zumach, second time on the show. Greg, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be back. It's good to talk about some positive developments with the Cubs and some additions that they've made. And obviously for anybody who maybe hasn't followed me or is just starting to see stuff online, on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it, I'm deep into draft now and at the MLB draft. And so I'm just excited to talk prospects and draft and Cubs and I don't know, good positive things as the weather starts to turn more warm and we're getting ready for baseball. Yeah.
One thing I love about this time of year, I always put something at the end of my podcast, like just go find ball. Like I've been out last couple weekends. I've been evaluating little leaguers for our league season. My youngest son's playing middle school ball. High schools are kicking up. Like there's baseball somewhere. Go find it. So I do want to get into some of the draft stuff, but since it's a Cubs podcast, let's start there. The spring training has been really cool. I don't know how much of it's the leadership change with Craig Counsell or just the fact that so many prospects are close to the major leagues, but it's been really cool to see a lot of guys getting really good time in spring training this year.
I think it is. It is really good to see it. And, you don't want to hinge too much about what the prospects are doing in spring training, which is not what you're saying. But it's always good to see it, right? Like when we see Owen Casey take really professional at-bats, it's so clear like how close he is and what steps he needs to take. It's still a work in progress, but for a guy who was effectively 20 all year in Double-A, I mean, what he did was really impressive. This year, he's likely ticketed for Triple-A. He's taking professional at-bats in spring training against major league pitchers. It's just good to see. Matt Shaw is the guy that's catching everyone's attention right now, and really has since the draft last year. And it's so clear that from an offensive standpoint that the Cubs really got quite a stud. If not to make this too MLB draft heavy right now, but if you were to kind of go back and do a redraft already, which you should never do with an MLB draft, you should judge it like 5, 6, 7 years out. But if you were to do it right now, there's a pretty compelling case that Matt Shaw gets taken like 6th, and certainly doesn't make it down to the Cubs at 13. Like he shouldn't have been there. The Cubs corrected that mistake very quickly, and what he's doing now is really impressive. We can talk a little bit more about the defensive position and questions going forward, later if you want to dive into it. But from a prospect standpoint, it looks really encouraging. I would say that PCA is probably the guy that I'm not concerned about him. I think he's in the middle of a swing change, but he's maybe catching some of the fans' ire, or concern. And I have to admit, I don't really share that concern as strongly as some of the vocal contingent on social media, from Cubs Twitter or whatever you want to call it. But I mean, it's still very clear now that there's still work in progress to address the swing change at the top of the zone. And so you see some really, really good things, and then you see some very clear, like, okay, this is where this guy needs to go. So it's nice to see these guys, quote unquote, like in person.
Well, and it's cool to see, like, on the one hand, I think we talked last summer around the draft that like 20% of drafted players ever make any appearance in the major leagues. And, but fans get caught up in what Corbin Carroll did, or the way Paul Skeens is shooting up the system, and some of these guys. And all of a sudden, like, if PCA at 21 is not cracking the Cubs lineup, I mean, online some places I'm seeing bus talk, and it's like 3 years too early for that.
Yeah, and not to call out specific people, but like, okay, so I got into a really, I would say, discussion that maybe didn't start out on what I would view as like maybe the right way to phrase this, but the end result was, at the end, the overall concept isn't something that I would disagree with, which is that despite PCA being so close and despite him having a high defensive floor, that he could still bust. And that is true, but that is true of any prospect. Like,
sure.
Like, there is a difference between an absolute floor, which for any prospect, I don't care who it is, Wyatt Langford looks like he can step right in and hit fourth in a major league lineup. He could still bust. So, like, there is an absolute floor of every prospect is minor leaguer. Yeah. That being said, there's also what most people who evaluate prospects look at, which is a relative floor. And the same thing for ceiling, too. Like, there's a relative ceiling and there's an absolute ceiling. PCA could somehow unlock his swing change, or you find out that he actually could have corrective eye surgery and get 28 vision and be Mike Trout. But, like, we're likely not seeing that. That's not a realistic ceiling. And so there's this window of realistic floor and realistic ceiling that gets raised because of the defensive floor. So that helps. Like, PCA doesn't even need to come up to be an average MLB offensive performer, something like a WRC plus of approximately 100, which would be average, to create a lot of positive value. You obviously want him to get to that point. But what he can do in center field is still very helpful, even if that's a process that takes 2 years to get there. And so I am still encouraged by what I see from him. I'm encouraged by the way the Cubs talk about him. I'm encouraged by, I'm not claiming to be Ken Rosenthal or Sahadev Sharma or any of these guys who are super cued in, but I'm very encouraged that in the limited stuff that I would hear from people connected with other teams, whether they be scouts, evaluators, executives, whatever, who happen to talk about things or kind of mention that they had heard their team is gunning for Cubs prospects, that PCA was very consistently being talked about in a, that guy's not on the table. Not saying they wouldn't move him for anybody, but it was encouraging that the Cubs weren't actually taking a look at things and saying, this is the time to move him. So, I think that's all to say he is a work in progress. I think we see him up here in 2024, no doubt. And I'm hoping that the work that he put in this winter with Dustin Kelly, sticks and we see the guy we want to see.
Well, and that takes me to the way PCA is rated. He's been consistently top 20 on every prospect list you look at for the last 2 years. Now, at one point, I think before last year's draft, he maybe peaked up around 8 on a couple of the lists. But, top 20, top 15, that's a really good prospect. And he's stayed there. And which takes me to your point about the absolute floor. I mean, that's where Brendan Davis was 2.5 years ago. There are just so many different ways to get to that guy who didn't pan out. I mean, I think Brendan Davis has shown this spring when he's been in there, those tools are still in there. Absolutely. just got to be healthy, got to get on the field and be able to show it over the course of probably a good month or two before the Cubs will be able to give him a look.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, Brennan Davis is probably the guy where if you look at things, and that story has not been completely written, right? Like,
No.
That, we know that, but for some folks that are like, that ship has sailed, the story is not completely written. But I would have to say that to go from like where he was mid 2022 to now is probably like a 20th percentile outcome. Just because you had the confluence of, there were some development steps that we were still a little tenuous on, the whiff rate, and the injuries were really like, oh man, that actually really like really was impactful injuries. That's not the guy who's always consistently getting dinged. I swear, like, there was some story, or we kept hearing stories about like he kept breaking fingers bunting, and I swear there were going to be people that follow Cubs prospects that were going to drive to 1060 West Addison and tell somebody to stop having Brendan Davis bunt. It just silly stuff like that. But this wasn't those injuries. It was really significant, scary injuries. And so, you had that with actual developmental steps that, it was a pretty low percentile outcome. But you're right. Like, any of these guys could unfortunately reach that absolute floor. And that's why you just want to have as many good prospects as you can. Because even though I follow all of these guys like really closely, I know you do too, even as good as they look, I'm not penciling them into lineups. I'm certainly not writing anybody in ink. I mean, I really like what Michael Busch is doing this spring. I'm not writing him into ink. I think you got to give him a long runway. I think he deserves it.
Sure.
But if we're sitting here mapping out like, this is what the lineup is going to look like in 2025, I'm not even sure what it's going to look like in late 2024. So, it's all that balance. Just have as many good prospects as possible, because some are going to bust. But when you get it all working and get a good amount of them cooking, it can be some really fun special times.
Well, and I know you and Greg Huss have talked about it, and I think Brian Smith as well on the Cubs on Deck podcast. But one of the things these kids are running into now, and maybe the one area of all their development that I think has been the biggest miss in the last, say, year and a half, is that 40 man is kind of clogged. I mean,
it is.
There's not a single guy I look there right now and think, the Cubs could just DFA him and just release him tomorrow. Like, everybody has value. And that means that guys like Matt Mervis, not getting a good read on him, or maybe even Canario a little bit more last year, although I know he was coming back from the injury, not getting enough read on some of those guys is causing some of this. Like, I think Matt Mervis could still be a player, but we don't really know.
Yeah, and I would have to say, certainly I think the Matt Mervis is the really interesting question. Because, like, with Alexander Canario, just like what you said, I mean, it was the injuries. Like, that guy...
it was.
I feel really strongly in saying that guy was going to be a major league player last year, Alexander Canario, more consistently. Whether it was in the Cubs organization or another organization, maybe like South Florida.
I thought he was primed to be traded before he got hurt in winter ball.
Yeah, Miami is the one that I really do think like he would be in Miami if he just didn't get hurt, and it's just a crazy situation. But regardless of that, it was the injuries, right? With Matt Mervis, I think he is still a major league player, and I would actually bet pretty decently strongly on it. I agree with you that I think the Cubs were in a tricky position because they did give him a decent runway last year, but they aren't in a position to do that again this year. And if he forces the issue, great. That's awesome, right? Like, everyone wins in that scenario. And you can always find at-bats for guys who are hitting. It doesn't really matter what you do. You can get pretty creative there.
Yep.
But they just don't have the ability to hinge their season on it. And I think he ends up playing a lot of Major League at-bats in 2024, 2025, 2026. It might not be for the Cubs, and I think I would still be rooting for that for him, because I think Matt Mervis is a great dude, and I think he's put in the work to deserve it, but it would be very different if it had been a 2022 season. You know, like if this was like Frank Schwindel.
Yes.
You know,
and that's when I wish they would have done it. I mean, the end of that season, I know there was the 40-man crunch, but I don't think they handled that well, personally.
I agree. I do agree. I actually think that one of the criticisms with the Cubs front office is that they are very they value 40-man spots, and while I think that is a valuable thing to do, there is some time that I personally feel like they overvalue 1 to 2 spots more than they should from an organizational perspective. I'm not the one making those decisions, so it's very easy for me to say that from the side, but just in conversations that I've had with folks who are just like, I really think that's overvaluing a 40-man. And they clearly disagree, and their actions over the winter, you know, continued that trend. But I agree with you. I think towards the end of 2022 would have been that would have been the time to bring him up and let him get those jitters out, and then you have a better idea what it looks like in 2023.
And you never know too. Like if he really shows something, maybe they don't start last year with both Hosmer and Mancini.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yeah, I still think you probably bring in one of them, but you're right that it is a very real chance that you get a look at him and you say, yeah, this is not the dude, you know, or just he's not ready, or he's not in a good headspace, or you can also address some of those maybe headspace concerns. I'm not saying that to be detrimental at all. I think that there was just some good reporting from Sadhav Sharma, and I think Patrick Mooney as well echoed this, that yeah, it was tough, and Matt might have been getting in his head like many young players do. So, you know,
I was a terrible high school player and I lived in my head.
Yeah, there you go, man. I did not play high school baseball, so I can't even say that. But in other sports, yeah, I mean, you get one play and you can do. I'm going to echo this. It's like, I don't know if it's a 1999 movie or something, but The Replacements.
Yes.
Yeah. Keanu Reeves, you know, and pre John Wick, of course, but he talked about a process called Quicksand, where you know, the harder you fight, you know, one bad thing happens and then more, and the harder you fight, the quicker you sink. And you know, despite that being kind of a silly movie, it really echoes. And so
it's so true.
I think with Matt, it's one of those situations where if he can hit well and he gets a start somewhere, I think he can really run with it. But yeah, it's fair to question things in hindsight. It's tricky to question things in hindsight, but I think it's at least fair with Matt Mervis to say, I wonder what it would look like if something was different.
Yeah. Well, and the one thing I come back to is when you have prospect status, you have, obviously you've got the prospect and the future, the theoretical future of this player that has some value. And then you have whatever it is he can give you today in your system or somebody else's system. But there's also, not to dehumanize them, but it's kind of a perishable asset. Like there's a point in time where you've just spent so much time in the minors, you're just not a prospect anymore because nobody cares that you're 29 years old.
Yeah, it's unfortunately true. And those are the guys that, like, you know, you look at things 3-4 years later. Honestly, let's use an example right on the Cubs roster, Patrick Wisdom, who was even DFA'd by the Cubs at one point to clear a roster move. I can't remember I think it was to get Braylon Marquez on for like the last day of the year in 2020. Yes. And I could be mixing that, but I think that's what
that sounds right.
Yeah. And then, you know, he came back. Anybody could have taken Patrick Wisdom at that point. They didn't. Now, I think it's fair to look at the ceiling of Patrick Wisdom and say, I'm not sure what necessarily, like, if he's got a long-term role with the Cubs, but that's getting in the weeds of saying he still was a pretty solid, has been a pretty solid major leaguer. He's carved out a major league role. That guy was a prospect. And once you get to that 28, 29, 30 range, I mean, you're just not anymore. It doesn't really matter. Even Michael Busch, people were having some of those conversations. Well, he's 25, 26 years old. Yeah, that's probably pushing it towards the end. And I think you can make a really easy case for why that's not that big a deal. But, like, had we been sitting there and Michael Busch was 28, he's not going for Jackson Ferris. You know, like what? Even if Michael Bush is just killing the ball, he's not going for that. So it is just age sometimes just is an issue.
And one guy I look back to, and I think it's probably a pretty good example of this value play over time, is look at Kyle Schwarber.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Cubs could have traded him after 2015 or 2016 for just massive return.
Anything. Yeah.
Didn't. Hung on to him to a point where he had a couple bad seasons, and the Cubs were trying to trim some money, and they wind up just non-tendering him.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen what he's done since. He became more of what he was expected to be. But no doubt, I would imagine after 2015, 2016, there could have been massive value in return.
In the middle of, yeah, exactly. So there were some really good conversations. There was a site at the time called like BP Wrigleyville. It's like a baseball prospectus site. I know Sahad of Sharma actually wrote for it for a bit, but they had a really good podcast at the time. And that was when I was like headlong into total fan side, fan aspect of it, not fan side, but fan aspect of it. I was listening to every podcast every day at 45-minute drives. So, I mean, I was just churning through podcasts, and they had a really good one. They talked about that very issue. And so I won't claim that any of this is, me coming up with it, but going back to like 2017, the Cubs had a pitching crisis. Now, It's funny that we think about 2017 still as like right in that prime, right? Like they had a great second half, and they ended up making the NLCS again for the third straight year. But when that was done, when that podcast was dropped, it was like 2 weeks before they made the Quintana signing, and they were sitting at like 43 and 45 or somewhere right around there. They were below 500.
Definitely a hangover that season.
Yeah, 100%, right? Like that is the classic hangover. That is why teams repeating is very, very difficult.
Yep.
But they had a crisis, and they were even talking about what the starting rotation was going to look like in 2018, and it was a disaster because the way they were describing it was John Lester, Kyle Hendricks, Mike Montgomery, and that was it. And they're like, that's. And Ryan Davis, who wrote for them and is still popular on Cubs Twitter or whatever, I know he's taken a step aside from talking baseball, said the line of, that's one of the worst rotations in all of baseball. And he's right. Like, it is. But getting back to what we were talking about, we're like, had they traded Kyle Schwarber, and I'm not advocating that they should have, but had they traded Kyle Schwarber in that winter after he had 2016 mystique and he, like a phoenix from the ashes, rose to be a really compelling, almost like World Series MVP case, they could have had anything. They chose not to. And that's probably fair and justified or whatever. You could make the same claim about other players on that roster. And it would have been hard from a mental standpoint to actually execute those deals. But the point is exactly what you're talking about, which is these teams are trying now, especially a Jed Hoyer front office, to optimize who are the players we keep for this period of time and who are the players that we move at this period of time. And they are not easy decisions. Matt Mervis, I think we can maybe go back and say there's a little bit of hindsight there, but also like executing and trying to make all these machinations work at one time is really tricky.
It really is. And a couple other guys that have stood out to me this spring is we see like Owen Casey's just crushing baseballs everywhere he turns. Obviously, he's not going to start in Chicago. Mm-hmm. He probably shouldn't start in Chicago. Maybe if there are injuries, we see him later this year. But if he keeps it up, he's just mashed at every level.
He's just mashing. I mean, that guy has been really good against advanced competition all the time. He had one really bad month in high A, and that was it. And since then, he's been really good. Like, he's had certainly more swing and miss to start last year at Double A. Mm-hmm. But it's also, regardless of how you sit on this, I think it's pretty easy to say that the pre-tacked ball affected things in Double A, whether you want to claim it's all that or if it's just an adjustment to more advanced pitching. Yep. Doesn't really matter. If you take that time in the last couple seasons, if you just take that period of time out with the pre-tacked ball, it looks really good. So Owen is great. There was some chatter about him making a concerted swing change, and it sounds like he even pushed back on that and said No, it's not really a swing change. It's just like an approach change. Certainly locking things in. Rich Deanna, who is awesome on Twitter. If you have a chance to follow him, I highly recommend it. He does great stuff with Cubs prospects, and he had evaluated what Owen Casey looked like a period of time before that, and it did look different, but it was a significant period of time, and so I think while that is a great picture of what it looks like, it also is just a young kid coming into his swing more, having a better approach, having an attack pattern that's different, and he's showing off against sometimes major league pitching, which is just really fun.
And that last thing you mentioned there is what I've really noticed this spring. I think, again, whether it's counsel or whether it's because these guys are just so much closer than they used to be. Like, it was cool last year at the end of a spring training game to see PCA come in for a couple innings, but these guys have gotten real at-bats against real major league pitching.
Yeah, like Matt Shaw started like a bunch of games early.
Yeah.
Which is fun. And I mean, for the prospect nerd in me, like, I want to see that. That's great. And even from the draft nerd in me, I really want to see it because I want to evaluate what I looked at this guy last year, pre-draft, seeing him in person, and what I looked at it now. It is a different... I'm not sure what that is. I don't know if that's a council thing. I mean, obviously, he's the one that designs the lineups. I don't know if that's an organizational thing. I'm not here to knock like David Ross. It's fine. I think it was a good move, but I'm not here to knock him or anything.
And the kids were in a different place last year too, so it might just be that.
It totally just, these guys were in Double A and now they can play. You know, it might truly be that, or it's an organizational philosophy that's changed now, but it is noticeable, and it's really cool to see that you're seeing these guys who are pretty close, and what I would imagine internally the Cubs, and they've even externally kind of talked about this, is the future, and the future is coming, that they're getting these at-bats, you know, where like Owen Casey is hitting behind, I'm probably mixing this up, but he's hitting behind major leaguers and in front of major leaguers, and that's just cool to see, right? Like, this guy's on deck and you're watching a major leaguer at the plate. So it is, it's definitely noticeable, and I think that it's a fun thing to watch.
I heard something recently, it might have been CHGO with Ryan Herrera, but somebody had talked to him, and one of the things when he got sent back to minor league camp that he left with was, now I know I belong in the major leagues. And that's just such a great mindset. Like, he's just going to go and crush baseballs until he gets back, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to have that confidence and know you can do it.
Yeah, so much of the game is mental, right? Like Yogi Berra said, 50% of the game is half mental, but I think it's selling it short, you know, even with the Yogi Berraism, that like so much of it is mental. And, you know, we talk about the quicksand aspect. It's very different.
That got PCA last year.
Yeah, absolutely. And
PCA in September was 100% the quicksand example.
It was. I think it was. The guy was trying to hit a grand slam with one person on base every at bat. And I'm not saying he's actually trying to hit a grand slam. Like, sometimes he was trying to bunt. He was trying to do overly impactful things when the situation didn't always call for it. And
I kind of wondered what would have happened if, like, one of his first two at bats, he just hits a ground ball deep and short, and he beats it out, and he's got that first major league hit.
Yeah. The one thing I wanted from September was to see him just get one hit.
Yes.
I didn't even care. It didn't matter what it was. It didn't matter if it's a home run. It didn't matter. As long as it didn't hurt a person on the field and he had to live with that, I think it would have been good. He's a tough kid, though, and he's a real tough mentality in a good way. And so, you know, hopefully that galvanized him a little bit. But yeah, I agree. Who knows if just in that first or second at bat, he just gets a blue single. Like, and then that's it. Yeah. And then who knows?
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite interviews I had Mark Weissman on back when he was the strength and conditioning coach in Myrtle Beach. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to him about different guys, and he was talking about how he had young guys and old guys, and PCA was this new kid splashing in. Yep. And he just had that drive like everybody else. Is like, what's Pete doing? And we're going to follow what he's doing. And he's just that dude. Yeah.
That is one thing. There was an interesting conversation I had with some folks who, you know, not these are fans, so it wasn't like team connections or anything. But somebody raised the question of like, and they use the term makeup, and they're like, I just don't like PCA's makeup, and this isn't to call this individual out or anything. It's just a different view on that. I don't view personality as makeup. I think they're very different things. Mm-hmm. But from when I talk to players, and obviously some players could tell me if they feel differently here, but the consensus that I've heard from players and teammates and coaches and all that is they love PCA's makeup. They follow his example. That doesn't mean that they all do what he does, and not all
sure.
can. But he's got great makeup from the feedback I've heard. He's got an interesting personality, but it's the kind of personality that if he's on your team, you love it, most mm-hmm. people. And if he's against your team, you hate it. And so, and honestly, I'm here for that. Like, I
love
here
those
for
guys.
that. It reminds me of the times like the Cardinals would have these players where you're like, I'm gonna like pull my hair out because they let that guy get a hit, and it's exhausting and infuriating. I want that on my team.
Yes, for sure. Well, one guy we'll talk about now and start to transition into the draft stuff is because you started doing your draft coverage in 21, right?
Yes.
So Jordan Wicks,
mm-hmm.
the Cubs' #1 pick that year. He's just been Mr. Steady through the system, and talk about the realistic floors and ceilings. Mm-hmm. He's probably never going to be an ace,
right?
But boys, he's looked good, and he looks like he can just lock down a 4-5 spot today and go.
I agree. He is a guy that the window between like your realistic floor and ceiling is a little bit narrow, where he's probably not an ace. And this is not to knock Jordan Wicks, who I love a lot. I really like him as a pitcher. But sometimes fans glom onto like, this guy said he's not an ace. Please don't aggregate this. That is, I don't think he is. The threshold for ace for me is a variable definition, but the threshold for me is usually about the top 8 to 12 pitchers in baseball.
I go about 15, but yes.
Yeah, totally fair, right? Like basically one every other team. Yeah, I think you can make a very good argument for that. So what I do, and I actually, this is a good discussion. I don't remember if I had this discussion with you on this, but I know I've had it on one of the podcasts where I've also moved away from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 starter to, I had an evaluator tell me one time to look at it from do you feel good about this pitcher taking 1 to 2 turns in a playoff series? Mm-hmm. Versus, is this pitcher a guy who can pitch in the regular season and give you some innings versus this guy is a spot starter? Like that's basically like the three delineations. And they went so far as to say like the people that you feel really good taking 2 turns versus 1 turn in the playoffs is also a little different too. But we're kind of getting to, is this guy a playoff caliber starter? And I do believe he is, which is the most important criteria for this Cubs team, in my opinion. I think his mentality is there to handle it. I think he's the kind of guy that isn't going to generate a ton of swing and miss, but he can get there, and he's really good. He's really good setup with the Cubs game planning system. The changeup is pretty close to elite. If nothing else, it's at least a plus pitch, probably a bit better. And I'm a little bullish still on the cutter possibility for that arsenal. We will see what that looks like. I think he needs to execute that better, but I still like that pitch long term. So yeah, I like Jordan Wicks. I think he's really good. Full transparency, I was just barely doing this in 2021, and while I had a couple hits with connections to the Cubs, like James Triantos, that was quite the coup there.
Yes.
I did not anticipate them taking Jordan Wicks. I was actually really surprised by that. I probably shouldn't have been, looking back on it, knowing what I know now, but I was really surprised. And I'm happy that it happened. And while there were a couple other players that they could have taken that would have been good too, like Colson Montgomery, for instance, or Gavin Williams, I think the Cubs got who I would view as somebody that's a potential playoff starter in Jordan Wicks, and I think that's quite fun.
Yeah. Well, I love that idea of not going 1 through 3, because nothing frustrates me more, especially on social media, than seeing some guy is, quote, just a 3. Mm-hmm. You know how freaking good a pitcher you have to be a number 3 starter in Major League Baseball?
Yeah, it's like a top unreal 30-ish, 40-ish pitcher in all of baseball. Like, it's immensely valuable. I mean, not to to relitigate the prior dynasty Cubs run, whatever you want to call it, from like 2015 to 2020-ish, I guess 2021. That team did not produce a Jordan Wicks. And there's a reason for that, right? They didn't take guys in the first round in general until 2017. But if you think about, not to relitigate this whole thing, but like, if you were to sit there in 2019, let's say, and the Cubs had a Jordan Wicks, somebody that you just feel good kind of locking down the back of a rotation. If you need him to, he could probably start a playoff game for that rotation. But just somebody that you feel good to just take the ball every 5 days. Holy cow. It is scary to look back on and think about what could have happened, because things are probably very different. The Cubs produced nobody like a Jordan Wicks. You don't need to be an ace to have a very impactful role in an organization, and I think Jordan Wicks can do that.
Well, and again, I'm pro players getting paid. I'm pro Tom Ricketts spending as much money as is humanly possible. But you look at building a roster. The Cubs were spending like $12 million on Tyler Chatwood for something that like a Jordan Wicks ideally would have filled.
I mean, to even go scarier down the rabbit hole, who knows what would have happened if the Cubs didn't have to pick up Cole Hamels' $20 million option because they weren't sure they had a rotation for the next year entering 2019, right? Like Bryce Harper, you never know what happens there. So, yeah, exactly, right? Like it is so important to develop your own pitching and to never run out of pitching. And while I think the Cubs still have the ability to add more pitching, because frankly you always can, they at least have some guys, right? Like Jordan Wicks, you feel pretty good about what he's doing. Ben Brown's looked really good this spring, and I think he's still got some steps to do and some questions to answer, but it looks really good. And you feel good about a guy like even Javier Assad doing what he's doing out of the pen, or maybe spot start or something like that. Like, the Cubs have some dudes. And that's not even getting. I
feel bad for Killian, because
I feel terrible for Killian.
He was really looking good.
I feel terrible. I'm truly very depressing. I really hope he comes back and just has some experience at the end of the season. But yeah, like, that's a guy that, he could have had an impact. That's not even getting to a Cade Horton, because I think Cade Horton's a very special situation. But like, just this other group of folks that can take the ball every 5 days or fill in when Imanaga needs, that 6th day or whatever, it's really big. And I'm excited for those developments, because a prior Cubs regime didn't have that.
Well, and also, what does it have to say about their own confidence in their pitching system that they could trade Jackson Ferris away?
It's very true, because, Jackson Ferris isn't getting moved.
Because I know he was a guy they loved.
Oh, yeah. And to the point that I feel very strongly that there's some bittersweet feelings in the Cubs organization about that, because they really love Jackson Ferris. Now, I think if Michael Busch goes out there and hits like he's been hitting and, locks down the Cubs' first base spot for the next 6 years, I mean, I think you look back on it and say, okay, like, that was an understandable process, and I think everybody can get on board with that. Even if Michael Busch has a good 2024 season, you probably look at things and say, all right, that was a good process decision, even if we're bittersweet about it. But yeah, Jackson Ferris is really good, and there's like no way that the Cubs are moving him for a guy like Michael Busch, without believing that you can develop other pitchers. And yes, the fact that Jackson Ferris is, several years away makes it make sense, but it's still, if you've got a barren list of pitchers, or dramatically less even, I'm probably not making that deal.
Yeah. Well, and you look at the draft, so we'll pick 21 because that's when Jed took over, and then that's also when you started covering this stuff, so it's a nice discussion point.
It's a good time.
21, they drafted Wicks, Triantos, Drew Gray, Christian Franklin, Parker Chavers,
Riley Martin.
And one of the things I took away from our interview last year is just the amount of fun that day 3 is, because you're just taking shots on guys.
Yep.
And the last 2 the first 2 drafts you covered, 21 and 22, on day 3, they came out with Scalzo Jr., BJ Murray, and Hayden McGarry.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, those are three guys who have looked really good this spring.
They have. And that's, again, this isn't to like relitigate the past, because it's very easy to look back on things and say, Cubs should have done this, Cubs should have done that. And very easy to do that years down the line.
Sure.
But I think at least criticism is fair that the Cubs nailed first-round picks in general and then missed after that. Not to say that they missed on everybody, right? Like Keegan Thompson has been up and is a major leaguer. Justin Steele has looked great. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Dylan Cease. And you certainly have your times that they show out. But in general, you're not getting too much out of like 15th round picks. Not easy to do it. Not something you should expect. I think the Cubs have done quite well. And that's maybe drafting philosophy differences. Maybe it's just the Cubs scouts at the time. Day 3, guys, is for dreamers, and mm-hmm. it's through a lot of grinding by the area scouts and the cross checkers. Like that's just kind of how it is. It's, you know, we've got our first game here in Omaha on Thursday, and the weather looks a little iffy, and you know, you got you know, if there's going to be area scouts there, they're going to be grinding through Midwest winter, you know, Midwest
yes.
Spring. And like, that's where you find some of these guys. And I think that is, they've done really well on day 3 and even later into day 2 as well. Mm-hmm. You know, I brought up Riley Martin really quick. That's a guy that went as a cost saving move. He's up in AAA. I project him to make his major league debut this year. That's a really good value, even if it's kind of up or down or whatever. Really good value. And so
same draft as Wicks.
They've done well. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just adding that Riley Martin was the same draft as Wicks.
Yeah. Yeah. In 2021. Yep. And so like, yeah, you feel really good about the things they did. Even in last year, we haven't seen most of them make as much of an impact because it's so quick and early, but they definitely took some really fun day 3 swings. And that's really what you want to see. You want to see an organization that you're going to get value up top, but then you're going to get some guys who make it through the system and potentially make it to the majors all the way through. You get 20 rounds. Yeah. If you're only getting value in rounds 1 and 2, it's good, but it's not great.
Yeah. Well, and to flip back to, we talked about the Cubs bringing up basically zero pitching for 5 years during that winning window. I don't remember. I had counted last year at one point. I think the Cubs had 11 homegrown pitchers pitch at some point during the season. I mean, not all of them were super impact guys, but you got, you know, you do have some big impact guys. You got the closer, you got Justin Steele. Yeah. You know, Jordan Wicks came up, made some big starts. I mean, just to see that change, the development has improved so much, whether it's how much of it's scouting, how much of it's development, it all goes together.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, and ultimately, they're going to be judged by the major league impacts, but they're starting to see major league impacts like you talked about, right? Mm-hmm. Like when your number 1 pitcher who's getting Cy Young votes is homegrown, and your closer, who's not getting Cy Young votes, but you feel very good about him and is one of the better closers in the league last year, is homegrown. You feel like you are developing things, and a lot of it goes to the pitchers going through adversity and coming back, especially those two. But a lot of it goes to development. Certainly from Steele and Ausla's perspective, who had to go through multiple different repertoire changes, mechanical changes, and the like, role changes,
injuries,
rehab. In many ways, those two are the shining examples of organizational work and player work. And then, you know, it's also the scouting, right? Like when you get major league pitchers that have that kind of impact, it is a collaborative effort of both player and the entire organization. They should be proud of that work. Now, job's not done, but like it's certainly very clear that what the Cubs have now from a pitching development standpoint was not what they had in 2019. You know, and some of that's a lot of it's probably Breslow bringing in the right people, but it's also the people that are still there. Yeah.
And it's exciting. And so as we look ahead to this year's draft, so now college baseball's going. I mean, you can go watch Hagen Smith strike out the world, and
Yeah, pretty much.
you know, we'll talk about Brody Brecht for a second. I'm wearing my Script I hat today, but now Brody's a guy pitching at Iowa, was a former football player as well, so multi-sport college athlete, so certainly top end athleticism. He's a guy who has maybe some of the best stuff. I've seen his stuff compared to Paul Skeens. What's missing is command. I mean, he'll go out there, and I think this year he has 42 strikeouts and 19 in the third innings, but he's also walked 25 guys.
Right.
And so, like, how do you look at him in terms of draft? I've seen a number of mocks lately actually having Brecht go to the Cubs, which I would love, but
Yeah. I don't, I will be fully transparent that at this stage, I don't have a sense for how the Cubs feel about Brecht.
sure.
That being said,
But you've seen that type of guy comes through. Like, there
100%.
are always those guys that have massive stuff and don't have the command yet.
yeah, so I saw Brecht when he was in the Big Ten Championship last year, pitching for Iowa, obviously, against Indiana, I believe. It was against Luke Seinard. And
Matt Shaw.
And Matt Shaw was in that same, it was in the game just a couple days prior or days after. And so Brody is a really interesting dude. The way I would evaluate him and the way I have evaluated him is and I'm still digging in on him and watching his footage and trying to drill down sometimes pitch by pitch. But he's one of the guys I'm paying attention to. What he has is a couple different things. He's got a really solid pitcher's body and frame. And so that is nice. The slider is plus. I think it could be potentially even better than that, but it's a plus pitch. I think it's consistently plus. I think he's able to generate swings and miss outside of the zone and chase, which is what you want with that pitch. But he also has been able to get swings and misses in the zone, which is nice just to have that in your back pocket.
Mm-hmm.
The fastball has extreme velo. So when I saw him in Omaha for the Big Ten Championship, he was sitting like 98 to 99 at the time. There were a couple times where it looked like it was about 100. Really hard to determine if that's stadium gun. Some of the scouts around me were saying that they had 100 on him. But we were talking upper tier velocity. Yes. Even later in the game, he was still consistently about 95, 96. I don't even remember a 94 at that point. And so we are talking upper tier velocity. Command is definitely a concern. And even in that outing, and what I've seen still in some outings recently, like he will have times where when it's close to the zone, he's getting some swings and misses, but he will lose it, certainly, and then has to try to dial it back in. Mm-hmm. And in that start in Omaha, he did, actually. I thought that guy was going to be gone in the second inning, and he really, really locked it down enough to get him through into the fifth. And so that's pretty impressive.
I remember that start.
Here's the question I have with Brody Brecht that I think some teams are going to have the questions of, which is the velocity is great. Will the pitch shape, as in the pitch movement, be good enough to actually compete once you get beyond the threshold in the lower minors where velocity is still going to beat hitters no matter what? Like
Yes.
if you are pumping kind of a bad fastball shape, and I'll explain that here really quick for any listeners, though I know you know. But if you're pumping 99 from a bad fastball shape in low A, you are probably going to beat most hitters. Just, it is hard to hit that ball. It is difficult, and even if you're pumping it in bad location and bad shape, people are going to swing and miss.
Yes.
Excuse me. Once you go beyond that, though, it is difficult because that ball looks a lot easier to hit against more advanced hitters. Now, that being said, there are pitchers with poor fastball shape that a major league organization can look at and say, this is an easy fix. We know how to fix that. We've taken X, Y, and Z pitcher who have had similar shapes. We did this, and we did that to them. And I think that's going to be the question that internally organizations are going to be having. What I mean by bad fastball shape is that very, very, quickly, it's the amount of movement that the ball is moving vertically, up and down, or horizontally, left and right. And what we try to avoid is fastballs like what we want is fastballs that look like they have a little bit of rise to them. It's physically impossible at pitching velocities to actually rise, but it absolutely, once you get into a particular metric, vertical movement or induced vertical break, but we don't need to get too much into that, where once you get above like 18 to 19 inches, it actually looks like the ball is rising. Imanaga is the perfect example of a ball that looks like it's rising. And Brody Brecht doesn't really have good vertical movement. Is that correctable? I think major league organizations are probably going to have a pretty good plan on that. I think he's a first rounder. I think the raw stuff is there regardless. Yeah. Even if you have command issues, you're probably like, this guy is, I really think at worst, a pretty impactful bullpen arm. And so, like, if you feel like you've got a 30% chance he's a starter, but a really good chance that he's a big-time pen arm, I think he's a first-rounder. I don't think he goes very deep into the draft.
Yeah, and that was the second question I was going to ask, because obviously starters have the most value. They always will. And if you can be, again, that multi-start in a playoff series kind of starter, there's your peak value. But yeah, if you've got like Luke Little, if you can come in and just bring heat for an inning, get inning in the third, get 3 to 6 guys out at the back end, or come into bases loaded situation, get a couple Ks. That's the kind of thing you have, and that's the one thing, again, like to your point, fastball shape is all very much in question, command, but like Brody Brecht doesn't get hit. Yeah,
he really doesn't. It's very difficult to square him up, which I think points to the larger perspective of, is that workable? I think major league organizations, I would be shocked if major league organizations, at least several of them, didn't feel like, yeah, it's very workable, we will take that chance. And so that the era of taking a guy who is only a pen arm in the first round is gone. That was like 2007, 2009, 2010 era. You would see college closers just get taken like in the middle of the first round with no plans to start them. They were 100% pen arms, but the whole point is just get value there. And long term, it's like, oh yeah, that actually was quite the fad. We shouldn't be doing that. But that being said, like, you're not taking Brody Brecht to be a pen arm. You're taking him exactly like what you talked about, which is we believe internally he can be a major league starter, but also with the foundation of, hey, if that doesn't work, like, we're still getting value, right? Like, that raises that realistic floor. And so you feel pretty good about that. The best example, they're very different pitchers, but the best example that I could point to that exact kind of philosophy is Hurston Waldrop last year out of Florida, where I evaluated him and I had very significant both fastball command and fastball shape questions. And I'll save my personal view on how I would develop him separately. But it was a very similar situation where the off speed was really good with Hurston Waldrop, probably a little bit better than Brecht, to be fully transparent. He had more pitches in his arsenal. But you felt like, if nothing else, Waldrop, if you make even if you don't make too many changes, he is an impactful major league arm, probably out of the pen. If you do make changes, he's a major league starting pitcher and a potentially very good one. I think that same kind of conversation will happen with Brecht, and organizations might feel a little differently, depending on each one.
Sure. So who are you watching this year? Like, who do you think is maybe in that middle of the first round sweet spot that the Cubs might be drafted in?
Well, if command improves, Brecht could be right around there. But we've spent a lot of time talking about him, so I won't belabor that point. Sure. There's a few guys that I really like and I've been kind of digging into. You're probably looking at a guy like Trey Savage out of East Carolina that I have some more question marks on, but he's a right-handed pitcher. He entered the year with just a really dynamic curveball. It fits that, like, if you're digging into pitching right now, there's a term that's put out there by Tread Athletics called a death ball. Jordan Montgomery actually throws one. Glasnow throws one, that kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And so he came into the season with that, and he threw it a bit in his first start, and I really liked it. And I had like 60, 70 grades on it last year. And he's not really throwing it this year, and I have no idea why. Like, maybe he just lost feel in a pen session. That being said, he's getting swing and miss on his slider and his split change, and so I really like that. And Trey Savage is a guy that, if we're talking pit fastball shape, he fits the example of a ball that looks like it's rising. He gets a ton of carry at the top of the zone, with sometimes 20 plus inches of what we would call induced vertical break, which looks like it's rising. And so, like, I really like Trey Savage. Some folks in the scouting community or MLB draft community like him a lot as well. I think he kind of fits somewhere in that range, and he would be a really good one. I'm trying to think of other guys that kind of fit. The problem is I keep watching players right now, and I keep thinking, like, that's a top 10 player in the class. But I'm saying that about so many of them.
Yeah.
That,
Jonathan Santucci. Yeah. He's a guy that seems to be rising up.
Santucci is a great example. I've watched him in most of his starts this season. And Santucci gets a really good slider. There was some chatter, and I'm not here to call anybody out. I'm not doing that. But there was some chatter about him, like he's throwing his changeup a whole lot more. And the folks I talk to that are tracking pitches are saying they're not seeing a changeup very much at all. Like, he does have a pretty good changeup. He just hasn't thrown it very much. So, again, not trying to call anybody out. I haven't looked at that particular data in particular, but I have talked to folks who are tracking those pitches one by one, and they're saying it is not a changeup. So, but he is getting a ton of swing and miss on his slider. Fastball probably needs a little bit of work, but he's still getting swing and miss on it. And, yeah, Santucci feels like right in that range there. I don't know where Braden Montgomery goes, but he's a guy, he is, to me personally, just an outfielder. He does pitch a little bit for Texas A&M, but he is just an outfielder for me, but a very good one, and probably a right fielder. But the offensive profile I love. I watched him in Omaha in the College World Series, and you could tell that he came in with a game plan against Chase Dollander, who was the 10th overall pick in the draft, and was able to get on plane, so he was able to get the bat in the right plane to elevated heat from Chase Dollander, which is not a very easy thing to do. He came in with an excellent game plan about how not to bite on the slider, swing on the slider. He just looked like a first rounder last year, and he's done great for Texas A&M, moving from Stanford over down south. And so I don't know if he's there, and I think we're still a little early, but I think he's somewhere in that range. And I've just really liked Braden Montgomery for a while.
One other guy that always pops to me when I see the name is there a better baseball name than Seaver King?
No, probably not. It's up there. I think I think it's certainly up there. Seaver King is an interesting dude. So for folks who aren't like super in the weeds of the draft, Seaver King plays for Wake Forest, who in general most years is really good. Kind of not really having their best year this year, but in general is a very, very good team, and they brought over some good talent. He was playing in D2 ball last year, but like smoked it for Wingate, and then went down a little bit onto the Cape and to USA Baseball and hit really, really well. Transferred over to Wake Forest. He's playing in the ACC. Almost said SEC, close, but the ACC, and is doing really well. Probably the big question that folks have on Seaver King is, can he rein in that plate discipline? Because right now he's making pretty good contact, but he does swing out of the zone a lot. Mm-hmm. And he still makes contact. So, like, is it an intentional decision? Is it something where it's like, hey, once you get into a pro plan, we don't want you to swing in that pitch. Even though you could potentially get a single, we think your overall outcome is going to be better if you don't swing. That's going to be some of the questions people have. Yeah. But he's looked pretty good in center. He could play second base too, and obviously he's playing for a good lineup. So, and he's shown some juice. He's not just a contact hitter. So yeah, Seaver King's a really interesting guy and probably in that range as well.
So when you're at this point in the season and you're starting to get your first early data, I know, like, not to overplay the Iowa thing, but a lot of teams that play up north, Michigan, Indiana, any of the Northeast teams, they're on the road for like weeks at a time playing in the South, versus teams in the South who are playing at home, and Florida, Ole Miss, all those.
Oh yeah,
Wake
California.
and NC State are doing their thing. How much does that play into the early performance, and do you sort of wait to judge some of those guys more on the whole season?
Yeah, I look for more outliers. So it's a great question. That's a really good question, right? Like, should all data be weighted the same? I would argue no on that. So at some point, I kind of do the eye test a bit and then use data to more reconfirm. That's like the vast majority of times I do it. So to be fully transparent, I don't have access consistently to TrackMan or Synergy or any of these data software.
I assume it's so hit and miss in college ball.
It's so hit and miss. I've been very fortunate to collaborate with some folks who've been kind enough to share information. The vast majority of my early reporting is done with the eye test, a lot of eye test. And then I'll reach out with certain data that I try to like reconfirm, or I say, hey, like last summer, I was digging into Trey Savage's starts. I was popping over to ESPN Plus, watching a bunch of Trey Savage, among a few other pitchers, and I was like, boy, that ball looks like it's really popping at the top. And so I reached out to some folks who would have information on that, and they're like, yeah, the carry on that is this, and this is what we're seeing. And so that's usually how I use data. When I look at it from now, there's still some of the eye test, but it's also pretty easy to paint a picture where, like, let's take Brecht as an example, right? Like, he just pitched in some pretty rainy conditions, and it was cold, and like, if his velo was sitting a tick lower, I'm not concerned about that. I don't believe that data should be weighed at the same as something if we see him hopefully pitching in like June, May, June kind of time. And so, yeah, like, I think you just have to, I won't claim to be a scout. I do this a little bit more on the amateur side, of course. And I won't claim to be one of the best scouts, even if you do find me as a scout. But I think the best scouts in the game tend to use the eye test, have a refined view on that with a lot of experience, and then the data helps reaffirm or maybe point out some things that maybe they didn't see that are outliers. And so, like, an example of last year would be Matt Shaw. Matt Shaw cranked a ball like close to 500 feet in the middle of terrible conditions when Maryland was playing.
Against Iowa.
Yeah, I think it was. Okay, all right. I was pretty sure on that, but I was like, I don't want to say that.
I think it was
like, that didn't
happen.
On that one. But I was pretty sure it was Iowa. And that tells something, right? Because that's really impressive in terrible conditions. If he has an at-bat in those terrible conditions that he hits the ball and it's like just awful and like 80 miles an hour, I'm not weighing that as much because that's not the type of major league outlier that we care about. And so, yeah, I mean, all that's to say, I use the data a little bit. I think it informs. I definitely look to see if pitch shapes have changed. That was something that came up with the Savage and a couple other people, where it's like, whoa, that curveball. I'm not seeing that curveball anymore. Am I missing this? And people are like, for whatever reason, he just hasn't been throwing it. So I think that's where the data is helpful. But yeah, I mean, if you're a slave to the data, if you're a slave to like draft modeling, I think you sometimes miss some really, really good players who, if you asked a scout, they would say, what are you talking about? That guy's awesome. And so I try to have a balance of it.
Sounds good. One more question here I've been thinking about, and I don't even know if you'll have an answer, but I know we've seen with the Cubs over the years, even going back to previous regimes, but especially under Jed, they're not scared of guys who have had Tommy John. I mean, they get Cade Horton, they draft Jackson Wiggins in the second round last year. Yep. With as common as that injury is getting, and some of those arm injuries, because of the velo, because of the stress on the arm and all the max effort throw, do you get a sense, and separate and apart from the Cubs, from other scouts and stuff, that there are teams that almost sort of target some of those guys because they've been through it already versus when is that guy's arm going to pop in my org?
Sure. So I won't claim that like that's the intention. in particular, but like I think you could make an argument that I would be surprised if somebody doesn't have that opinion. But in many ways, this is just my sense of it from looking at the outside, there is some value in targeting players that maybe aren't as valued by other organizations. For instance, there are some that are going to be scared of that injury risk and so not value that guy as much. Cade Horton's maybe an interesting example because the gist that we've gotten since, and I think this is now in report, so it's not anything outside, not inside info at this point, but Cade Horton went 7th. He wasn't making it past pick 10 or 11. The Cubs were not on an island. They were the teams immediately following them were taking Cade Horton if he was there. So he's an example of a guy that, yes, he came back from Tommy John, and some teams wouldn't have loved it, but like he also threw, and so you felt really good about it. The Jackson Wiggins thing is different, and I think teams felt very differently about Jackson Wiggins here. In the sense that you couldn't see him throw. He didn't have Tommy John surgery with your surgeons or the people that you vet out. And so there is higher risk there, and not every team is going to feel as comfortable about that. And so it is really interesting, but I do feel like the gist was that the Cubs saw him in such peak form that they felt like it was worth the risk to take that chance that he comes back to that. And they felt like it was a unique opportunity where he was just being undervalued by other teams. Kind of getting to your point.
So maybe not seeking him out for that reason.
Yeah, I don't think so. I certainly don't get the sense that the Cubs would have preferred him to have Tommy John surgery.
Sure.
Because then he got it out of the way. But that being said, like it's not the first time I've heard that opinion about, the concept. But it just felt like they felt like had he been pitching that season, there's no way he would have made it down to their selection. And so take him because it's worth that risk. And you feel really good about taking, or you felt better about that risk because you feel like Matt Shaw is going to provide so much value there.
Yes.
That you can roll the dice a little bit. In a separate concept, but tangentially related, I do believe that the Cubs feel like there are certain types of pitching profiles that are undervalued. I'm not saying this from like inside information, but just looking at the types of guys that they're targeting, they clearly higher on their board. And that's pitchers who throw with what we would call a supinator bias, which actually is not Cade Horton, and I was surprised by this, looking at his pitch shapes, but guys like Porter Hodge is a good example, where they naturally, the fastball doesn't have as much of the rise, but it actually has a little bit of like imaginary cut or relative cut to the pitch. We're not going to go too deep into the pitching mechanics. I'm happy to talk about it if you want to, but what it does allow them to do is throw breaking balls a little bit better with different types of movement. And so we see like sweepers and we see cutters and we see, a couple other things as well. And those supinator pitchers, it's basically wrist orientation if you're not watching on YouTube here, but it's effectively like a pronating throw is straight ahead, and that's like the backspin. I wish I had a baseball here.
That is just pulling down on the four seam.
Yeah, exactly. That is like
backspin.
Yep, it's pulling back on the four seam, and I won't claim to be a pitching expert, but this is the vibe here. This is the classic rising fastball mixed with the power curve that, like the Houston Astros, every single person in the minor leagues was basically throwing that pitch. And that's how they won the World Series, and it worked very well for them. So pronating, like straight ahead. Supinating is a little bit of a different wrist movement. So it's kind of like a little bit more, instead of straight ahead, it's a little bit turned. And so it's the supination, it's picking up a spoon versus pronating. Won't claim to be a physical therapist or a kinesiologist either, but that's kind of the gist. And so you can have pitchers who have a bias towards one or the other and still learn how to throw the other pitches. But if you're thinking about the overall volume and the natural muscle memory that's going to happen, there are certain pitchers that are going to gravitate or move or tweak their ball just as there's natural differences there, and it's going to switch to that. So going back to where we're talking about it, pitchers with that kind of a throwing motion, the supinator bias there, were less in demand, so to speak, from some organizations. And so oftentimes those guys weren't taken by other organizations, and they were sitting there. And so it's one of those where it's like, you know what? We know exactly how to develop those guys. We're going to teach Porter Hodges sweeper. That's exactly what we're going to do because we feel good about that. And he fits the profile of a guy that does that well. And so then you end up with a guy like that. And so I think that there are certain pitchers that they took where the Cubs have broadened that. I think Cade Horton's actually a good example of somebody who isn't that, but they felt like they could do other things with the profile. And they've broadened that, but they started at that position where that was undervalued, and so they kind of pounced on a few of those pitchers.
These discussions are so much fun because it is just a continuation of Moneyball.
It is.
Back in 2001, it was, let's value people who walk. Now it's like specific hitter profiles and pitcher profiles and certain pitch types. And that's how you get like a Justin Steele contending for the Cy Young on 2 pitches.
100%, right? And that fastball is a unicorn. Like that is a term that's used, but it is actually in that is a good example of what we would call that relative cut. And his fastball is to the point of it's so extreme that it's actually basically a cutter. But even when it just started, it was a ball that, I'll say this really quick. The average fastball, the straight fastball, so to speak, runs 7 inches in towards a right-handed batter if you're a right-handed pitcher. That's actually a straight fastball, so it still moves 7 inches in.
Yeah, it does.
And it's weird, right? But when you look at it straight on the TV, that's what it looks like. It actually
runs right into the bat.
It runs right into the bat. But there are fastballs that actually go straight down, like straight in, and that with 0 inches of horizontal movement. But it looks like it's a cutter to hitters who are expecting 7 inches of run. Like that's a pretty beastly cutter. And that's the kind of thing that the Cubs have actually done really well with those type of pitchers because it's kind of a little undervalued. Those guys were getting, unless you were an extreme example like Clayton Kershaw, you were generally getting pushed to the side if you were that type of a pitcher for a few years. And so now, the Cubs kind of feel like, hey, that's a pitch type we can work with.
It's fun stuff. I love digging into this stuff. I've got one of my upcoming episodes will be with a former pitcher who was at Wake Forest and pitched in the Nationals organization. We're going to talk like pitch labs and pitch shapes and all that kind of stuff.
Hopefully this is a good precursor. They're going to know so much more. I'll be diving into that. I'll be interested to hear what they say. Somebody who's an actual expert on that subject.
Yeah. It's going to be fun. But no, this is great. Thanks for coming on, Greg. When are you going to start chunking out the draft coverage?
Very soon.
Is that more like the very soon?
Yeah, I've got my mock draft 1.0. It's gone through a couple different iterations, but the players are locked. It's more just the time to actually write it. So I'm doing that now. Those things are too long, but I have a lot of information. So for every mock draft I do a breakdown of each team and their past drafting tendencies as well, just to kind of provide that's where that comes from, especially early on. No teams are like, this is our guy. That probably doesn't even happen until like the draft. So it'll be based on historical tendencies and asking around from different experts. So that's coming out very soon. And then, we're really digging into the big stuff here coming up.
Excellent. Well, where can people find you?
So you can find me, I don't know if we're calling it Twitter or X or whatever, but you can find me on Twitter.
It'll always be Twitter to me.
At IV Futures. That's where you'll find me. I also spend a lot of time writing at Northside Bound. That's really the only spot that I write. And we cover MLB draft, which is, more what I focus on, but tons of prospects for the Cubs. That's our heavy focus throughout the year. We're always talking Cubs prospects, so it's an exciting year. Please dive into our content there. And then we've got a really great community at 1060 West. It's on a Discord, which is free to use. It's always free. So please, if you're interested or want to jump in with our conversation, we keep it light, we keep it fun, we keep it very congeal. It's a good community, a very friendly community and positive community. So please reach out if you want to invite to that. We'll probably do another invite, an open invite here right before the start of the new season. So, happy to do that. But otherwise, yeah, just look forward to talking baseball with a lot of folks.
Great. I always recommend Greg's stuff. It's great having you on again, Greg, and maybe we'll talk again this summer around the draft.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share the episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, BlueSky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS+. And check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/CubsPS+ to help support the show. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the Cubs PS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!